Welcome to Pep Talks, the patient engagement podcast, where we discuss patient, family, and community engagement in health research and healthcare. I'm your host, Sandra Monroe. Our guest today is Kienan Williams. Kienan Williams is the program lead innovation and research with the Indigenous Wellness Corps. Kienan is a member of Sandy Lake First Nation, a fly-in community located in northwestern Ontario. Kienan holds a Master's in Public Health from the University of Arizona and a Bachelor's of Science from the University of Toronto. Over a span of more than 17 years, he's worked with First Nation communities across Canada, providing knowledge and expertise in areas of governance, comprehensive community planning, housing, justice, education, and early childhood development. Kienan is an accomplished Indigenous leader whose passion for improving the quality of care and increasing health equity for Indigenous people shines in his commitment to advancing Indigenous health through several innovative research initiatives. In this episode, Kienan shares key aspects of Indigenous research as well as Indigenous-led patient and community engagement research, also known as PACER, sponsored by the Alberta Health Services Honoring Life program. The Honoring Life program is a youth life promotion and suicide prevention program developed to support First Nation and Métis communities. To learn more about the PACER program, you can go to episode 1 of the PACER series with Dr. Maria Santana, the scientific director, and Ingrid Nielsen, the instructor for the PACER program. So thanks so much for being here today, Kienan. We are lucky to have you as a guest speaker. I just want to mention that we got connected through Tracy Wasilick from Alberta Health Services, who, as many may know who are listening to this podcast, is one of the founders of the Patient and Community Engagement Research Program and a huge champion of the program. And she reached out to me by email because she really wanted us to do an episode or some episodes with some of the Indigenous-led PACER research teams. And so this brings us to you. We connected to you via email, or she connected you and I via email. Yeah, we're excited to learn more about why we're speaking to you. I think you bring a lot to the table. So I wonder if you can start by giving us an introduction of yourself.
Thank you, Sandra. And I like that you started off with the importance of relationships. I know that my relationship and work with and alongside Tracy has been amazing over the years. And I first got connected with her in 2018 when I started working at Alberta Health Services. So it's very timely that we're able to open up in that same way, especially for our topic today. But before we get into there, I guess a little bit about me. I'm a member of Sandy Lake First Nation, so that's a flying community in Northern Ontario. I've spent most of my life or my early career in life in Ontario, and then for the last 10 years, I've been in Alberta. So for the last few years, I've been working with Alberta Health Services, and currently I work in the Indigenous Wellness Corps as the program lead for innovation and research. What that means and why I'm so excited for that and why I like my job is that we get to use our Indigenous voices and knowledge systems. What I'm most excited about is our approaches to critical thinking that can really contribute and focus in a patient engagement and knowledge generation, because that's all that research and innovation is. Um, but I find, and one of the values that I live by and that I connect with many Indigenous communities and colleagues is saying, hey, how can we work for our communities? And what work can we do together using our skills to support the health, well-being of our family members, community, and nations living across Treaties 6, 7, and 8 in Alberta? So a little bit about me coming in here. Um, but really, I love how in Alberta we've got a pretty robust learning health system. And the PACER work and the work of Abs4U is a wonderful example of how getting patients into work, into health innovations, into services, service planning and evaluation, really strengthens things, not just for the individuals and the individual patients being impacted, but promotes and strengthens the whole health system for everybody when everyone is best supported and health outcomes are improved. So why Indigenous? And I one one potential challenge that I've always struggled wrapping my head around here has been saying, we want to get a patient and family advisor who's Indigenous. I'm like, great. Uh, what do you want that for? It could be anything from neurological to mental health to primary healthcare emergency department. We've got a full spectrum of health services and research we can do with and by Indigenous people. But one of those challenges that I often find is when researchers approach and are like, okay, and it almost sounds like being Indigenous is the disease state. And I'm like, no, 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 don't talk to us as patient engagement and patient partners just because you think there's a deficit-based approach that could be brought forward by having Indigenous voices present. Invite us and build a relationship with us that is based on our strengths, that's based on our experiences. There are different sociocultural impacts. So, eye smudge, for example, how does that impact and my traditional approaches to wellness impact my grounding, spirituality, and in particular, emotional health? Whereas, I just Sandra, you and I were mentioning as we were preparing for this meeting that I had a bum knee and had some knee surgery. Well, physically, I healed just the same as everyone else, and my recovery period has just been the same. But there is a bit of a legal difference between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, depending on the work. And those legal differences really can impact, in my program lead job at AHS. A lot of my work is saying, okay, are we talking about Indigenous people and practices and choices, or are we talking about federal and provincial legislation that changes how we do our work and how we live our life? And that also impacts the access to healthcare services that are available to and for us, much less the safety and security of accessing those. So, just bringing it back to patient engagement generally, the strength of having Indigenous patient partners in any work is the fact of having a strength-based perspective that many non-Indigenous researchers may have awareness of, but might need to contextualize, well, what does this mean? And are we talking about the same values or putting on my researcher hat, there are all these confounders that come in. And I'm like, whoa, 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 you're not talking about Indigenous people. You're talking about a structure or process that impacts us as Indigenous people. And then just coming down to specifically Indigenous PACER cohorts, I've been very grateful and honored that since 2018, in my job, I've got to play with and support and learn alongside three or four patient or cohorts of Indigenous patients. My first introduction to the PACER program was through a province of Alberta, government of Alberta cancer grant that was supporting Indigenous voices in research. And their goal and the whole idea behind it was saying, hey, we want to support the voices of Indigenous peoples in the health infrastructure and research system within Alberta. What are some approaches and skill sets to make sure that those Indigenous patients are entering and supported as equals to researchers and academics? And the PACER program was able to really provide a number of those practical community-based researcher skills that in many ways were in alignment with um, uh, how we communicate in our communities. And in other ways, it was fascinatingly different when we had friction points. And it was like, oh, well, why is this different? And how could we be more curious about um, moments like these and use it as a learning opportunity? So I've enjoyed the PACER program and supporting Indigenous patient engagement uh, throughout my AHS career and look forward to doing so, continuing to do so.
Thank you for sharing all that background information. I'm just wondering if you can share some key ideas that people should consider when engaging with Indigenous peoples as partners in research. What does that look like?
Well, thank you, Sandra, because just touching on the topic of power dynamics, um, there have been power dynamics with research and Indigenous people and a legacy that lasts 100 years or more of vastly negative experiences on the whole when I think through what has impacted my family or lineage in our communities. And so, how does that impact today? Well, there's a distrust that happens before you walk into that door. And distrust with a health institution is not a uniquely Indigenous problem, but I do think we're disproportionately impacted when you look at the various experimentations that happened when research ethics were a vastly different field and indigenous knowledge and indigenous critical thinking has directly contributed to expanding. How do we do research in a good way? How do we make sure that the non-white male Caucasian in the 60 plus population is able to have more voices and perspectives to inform what is happening now? How is the health of people living in Alberta or Canada or the world impacted, strengthened, or something like that? And I'm not asking for special treatment or being different or an equity-based approach just by saying I exist and I should be here. Plenty of people can, and that's okay. The reason why I want a seat at the table is to be able to say, myself as a status Indian, as a First Nation man, as an Indigenous person not from this province. So I'm a visitor in this territory as well. I get to be able to say, my experiences, my knowledge, my interactions with the health system are in a certain way based on legal, social, physical, and cultural impacts. And therefore, I might see the health system in ways that others may or may not. And if we address the limitations or the vulnerabilities or the areas where patients or someone might drop through the cracks or might inadvertently not necessarily get the best care, if we identify those and address those working together, we strengthen the whole health system for everyone. We make it we reduce the cost by getting most appropriate care closer to home sooner, and we're able to improve the patient reported outcome measures or the PROMs and PREMs from a qualitative perspective better by saying, hey, I had a good experience there. And you know what? I was really nervous walking in those doors because I have immediate family members, or I might myself have had a negative experience walking through those hospital doors or accessing health services in ways that I go, oh, geez, this might scare me. Um, and these are not imagined risks. These are not um, contemporary, or that happened a while ago. I've had these sorts of arguments come up before, and um, the disproportionate impacts on health. I don't prefer taking a deficit-based approach, but a couple of quick facts. The government of Alberta, before the pandemic, identified the life expectancy of a First Nation person in this province was nearly 12 years lower than a non-First Nation individual. Fast forward to today, and that life expectancy gap has increased. It's currently nearly 18 years less. And so why do we need Indigenous voices in patient engaged research? It's because we are being impacted, and if we address some of our core access and governance and cultural safety and appropriateness or transitions in care, um, that just improves things for everyone. And here's the thing. I don't want to be known as the deficit-based individual, but I do know that I walk into some rooms, meeting rooms, engagement with colleagues who say, "Hey, I saw in the news that Indigenous people have whatever the negative stat might be relative to other people," and saying, "I want to help." I'm like, "Excellent." Um, I want to start by reframing and refocusing because then we can say, hey, I want to be a partner with you. And I acknowledge that we both have strengths and we both have limitations. And your area of interest is blank, whatever it may be. Um, but let's start changing the narrative. Let's establish even in our own approach we started this part, like I was interested in the notion of power dynamics, and there are power dynamics between researchers and the participants and individuals that they work with. Again, the value of the PACER program has been to be able to support Indigenous patients who have a vast array of lived experience, interests, and want to be able to support the health and well-being of their family members in different ways. So the PACER program is able to give some of those practical skills and experiences. But honestly, I found most of those experiences we did in our own world, community, and could speak to. So the PACER program was able to compare and contrast and give us additional tools in our patient impact toolbox to be able to work forward. And when we when we're working with researchers or when we're working on a team, let's not even necessarily call it researchers, to say we want to come together for a good purpose to do good things that benefits the health and well-being of people we care about, even if we may or may not ever meet them. Um, I think a lot of us, that's not an Indigenous focus thing. That's a come together perspective. So recognizing the strengths that we as First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people can bring to the conversation is great. I'd love to mention three key ideas that I regularly, as part of my Alberta Health Services job, introduce when I'm starting a new conversation with a different research team or group of people wanting to work in Indigenous health. The first is about the importance of relationships. Now, the term that I'm most familiar with is relationality, but really it is just relationships between, well, here's a great example. Uh, Sandra, you started off this podcast introduction by saying you're talking about this. There was opportunities. Your relationship with Tracy was able to be the warm handoff to be a relationship between myself and you. And now hopefully sharing some of my words and experiences with whomever might listen to this podcast. So I those relationships between people, between ideas, between institutions, between cultures and peoples, all of that is just recognizing that we all have some type of connection with each other. We live, not to oversimplify, but I'll put my little scientist hat on and say, listen, we're on the same planet with finite resources working together, and we're connected not just as people, but to the land, to the spirit seen and unseen, to the life that is found itself everywhere. So, one strength of working with Indigenous people I regularly find, and at the risk of making a pan-Indigenous statement, and the reason that's a risk is to say all Indigenous people do a certain thing the exact same way. And I'm like, well, no, because I'm a I'm a Cree guy that goes to Blackfoot Sundance experiences down in southern Alberta. And I'm like, man, this is not my neck of the woods, but this is so valuable and learning and different, and I'm excited. So bring that curiosity with you, bring that excitement with you. But more importantly, be respectful of the relationships that you have. And so, relationality in terms of patient engagement research means protecting the patient safety. So, who are you going to recruit? What are their lived experiences? What are some barriers or tangible experiences they might have that'll be a barrier to our work, that the research team may or may not be aware of? But having an Indigenous patient partner might be able to say, oh, hey, yeah, that's great. You want to do a great example was apprehension. I remember working with it was a um, child and a family and child support related health service, and they were using the language of apprehension of I'm being nervous, or we want to reduce parents being nervous using deficit-based language. Of the nearly 10,000 children in care right now in the province of Alberta, that's publicly reported by the government of Alberta, nearly 7,500 of those children are Indigenous, and those are apprehensions. It's child welfare apprehensions that is a moving field right now. So, federal legislation called Bill C-92 is allowing a mechanism for Indigenous communities and organizations to take over or lead their own child welfare societies, agencies, and supports in the hopes of keeping families together. But you can imagine if it was a research team saying, yes, we want to talk about patients' apprehensions to accessing child and family services or supporting the health of your child, and that has a vastly different connotation with very real world barriers that can be addressed if the team is aware, but could pose a barrier without that voice and kindness and support. So, that Indigenous patient partner in this case, especially with PACER developed skills, are able to communicate and bring their own relationships to that table in conversation to say, the impact of this work is far beyond me. Have you considered X, Y, and Z considerations? Because the impact, if we do or don't address these, will disproportionately impact Indigenous people and patient recruitment. So if it's a broader pool, let's say you're looking to get a whole bunch of individuals together, that might accidentally exclude certain voices like Indigenous people through the recruitment, even though the team always thought that it was safe and respectful. On the other side, just starting that relationship is one way. So you and me through Tracy, that's a wonderful relationship connection and handoff. Just like when we're all done, what did we accomplish together? What were the lessons learned? We're not always going to be successful, and that's fine. But even through the things that did not work out, what can we grow and share together? And that accountability piece at the end of a relationship or at the transition of research work from one state of readiness to another, it might start as grant funded or something, and then it moves into a different phase of work or the project might complete. I very much encourage that importance of let's be accountable to all our relationships that inform this work, and let's support saying, hey, this is what we did together. This is how it supports you. This is how we hope it was in a good way. And what would you like to do next together? Or if there's nothing right away, we welcome and keep the door open because now we've established this relationship. Now we know what each other's gifts, awareness, strengths, and limitations are. So when future opportunities arise, you can reduce the amount of effort that goes into the project initiation because relationships have been established that set expectations, protocols for working together, um, conflict resolution necessities that happen across multiple jurisdictions. So, across the academic or health institution or federal, provincial government. Like, it's a complex environment we as people find ourselves in. And there's additional considerations when focused on Indigenous peoples.
Keenan, you are such an eloquent speaker, and I could listen to you all day, and I'm learning so much just in this first, I don't know, 10 minutes or however long we've been talking. I love you said the life that's found itself everywhere. And I love being out in the nature. I find it very therapeutic. And so I had all these visuals running through my head, and then you just kind of like packaged it into this little sentence. But it's amazing how even just one person can make such an impact and change. So thank you for sharing all of that. I also, when you were talking a little bit more about deficit-based language, it reminded me of, and I sort of the word that came to mind that we tend to use, like even when we're say conducting focus groups or whatever, is trying to hold safe spaces for people. And I think when you approach things in a deficit base, you're kind of almost setting the stage where you're getting people to think or a certain way. And when you frame it differently, it allows people to potentially open up and frame it in a way that resonates and makes sense to them. And I have a friend who's from Sturgeon Lake, Saskatchewan. His name's Cliff. And we were talking about safe spaces one time, and he's reframed it. And I love the framing of this because it's not just safe space. And so he calls it brave spaces. Because in order to try to hold a safe space, but the individual who's there, or the people that within that space also have to have some courage or be brave enough to then make that first step in sharing and opening up. And so I feel like that brave spaces captures all of it because they're like safe spaces is one thing you can think you're holding a safe space, but if people aren't sort of taking that first step to share, there's vulnerability in sharing with one another. And I think that does get easier once we start building those relationships. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing all of that, all those ideas and ways of connecting and working together.
I love the notion of brave spaces, and I appreciate that you use the word vulnerability there. Um, so if relationality is one key concept that I find I'm talking about all the time in my day-to-day work, another one would be ethical space, which I suspect it encompasses what Cliff was talking about and sharing with you. So ethical space was originally proposed by Elder Willie Ermine, and it talks about how multiple, and this is my interpretation, how multiple people, power dynamics, roles, responsibilities, so not just ethnicity, but dynamics, institutions, everything can be contextualized in terms of are you willing to sit in a space with someone who may or may not be like oneself and be willing to share my experiences and my voice and my importance, my truth in many ways, while also being receptive to listening to the truth and importance and values of people who, again, may or may not be like me. The concept of ethical space as it applies to in something like the health institution that has, just like anything else, there's a continuum of good, bad, and anything else in between. But when we as health service providers, or if there's government partners, that let me compare and contrast an ethical space example. Um, I've had some really, really nice and well-meaning individuals who've come forward with a wonderful research idea. They can get the money, they have the teams and skill sets, and as they approach, what I hear and my conflict as a First Nation individual in an Indigenous role and a health system is when I hear someone say, hey, the health of Indigenous people is so bad, but I can fix this part of it if you just sign on the dotted line with me and get some people together. They never ever say it in quite those same words, but at times that becomes the undertone. And I have that conflict because at times I'm like, man, I don't want to enter into that space because what if I'm only validating or reinforcing existing stereotypes or perceptions about us? What if I'm playing a tokenism role in terms of being the individual person speaking on behalf of all Indigenous people? These are just some common realities that we experience. But when I'm working with an individual who says, I want to help. I'm pretty good in these areas. I don't know what the entire reality is, and I'm honest to goodness scared because what if I screw up? I'm apprehensive, eh, that I might cause more damage than people have done in before, and therefore I'm not even going to start. I'm not even going to do anything because the danger of screwing up outweighs the benefits of trying. And I say, go out and have that relationship, establish that, and say, can I support you? Is there something of interest? And that vulnerability of sitting in that ethical space, people may or may not sit with you, but if you are present, then I have noticed over time that people do come together and when the time is right, need matches opportunity, and we can work forward in that way. And just commenting on deficit based, and this is how usually try to pivot a conversation when doing an exploratory meeting on future work with researchers and others. I say, excellent. I know that we need the deficit-based numbers for the background and the funding opportunity to justify something is bad. Give us money and it will improve if we do X, Y, and Z. And at that point in time, I turn around and say, what is the core of the problem that we're trying to address here? How is it impacting Indigenous people the same or differently than other groups of people? And what is the role that this individual, this researcher, is asking of myself directly? And by extension, all my relationships through this work. And those relationships might be community members, it might be colleagues, it might be any number of different definitions of the term. The third concept that I just briefly want to touch on is the importance of two-eyed seeing. Two-eyed seeing was articulated by Elder Albert Marshall. He's a Mi'kmaq elder who was basically saying, we're humans. We have two eyes. So why don't we extend that thinking to have one perspective in many times being non-Indigenous, or I often work with Western trained approaches. In this case, PACER as a methodology is, in my experience, a Western-based approach that I'm quite comfortable using in a two-eye seeing methodology. So what's the second eye? Well, that's the Indigenous perspective. And again, if we only leave it there, then I'm not happy because there's no single Indigenous perspective when it comes to a topic as complex as patient engagement and research. So, who are the Indigenous people present? If I was there and I'm working with some of my friends and colleagues just south of Edmonton, then we could start saying it's a Cree perspective and it's a Nahewan lens through the Indigenous eye, and we have the Pacer lens through the Western trained eye And you know what happens when you look at something with two eyes? You have an increased field of vision and you have increased depth perception. So when that happens, I'm like, yes, let's have Indigenous peoples and voices present because our views and impacts of the research is both broader and deeper just by virtue of having our voices at the table.
Oh my goodness. I have so much going on thinking about so many different things. I appreciate you sharing.
I appreciate opportunities where individuals can bring their whole self and be it a podcast talking about research, be it the research itself that I find exciting and interesting just because, research is can be boring and have boring steps, but I find if the space for individuals to bring their whole self, whatever they define and believe that wholeness is, again, I just see it as making more robust research outcomes and knowledge being generated, as opposed to when I work with Western trained colleagues who struggle when they're like, we have to be non-biased and we have to take out our spirit, our own perspective, our own this, that, and the other. And I'm like, I disagree with that notion only because we can't be confounded by our own biases, implicit or explicit, as an example, because that makes knowledge that is unscientific and that it can't be replicated and validated and reinforced. And those are checks and balances and truth seeking, ultimately. But I do see a limit, I do see a strength when I can say, you know what? My spirit is heavy at this stage in the research. I'm not sure why, but can I just share that in the safety of this team? And in that particular example, someone said, "Oh my goodness, I'm so glad you said something because just something felt icky, but we followed rigorous methodologies. We followed research ethics board approved practices. We are doing the best of evidence informed and peer reviewed literature in this approach, and yet things still seem off. And we're able to identify what it was. And it was outside of the scope of the research, but within the scope of us as responsible humans and individuals to say, you know what, our lived values are not quite coming up here and how can we better support the patients after the experience had occurred and after our data collection reporting. So just by virtue of saying, you know what, part of me is not comfortable and connecting in that way, we made our work stronger as a result. I will not take credit that that was an indigenous knowledge paradigm saving the whole thing because that's a risk itself. I'm just saying myself connected with my own journeys and the relationships that have formed me meant that I went, wait a second, there's a friction point. And I'm glad I had the voice and the ethical space and the two-eyed seeing and the relationality to speak up and have an impact there.
Yeah, thanks for building on that, Keenan. I would like to add and challenge that whole concept of non-bias. But before we started this podcast, we talked about this idea around perspective is everything. And I think this is the uniqueness of the patient and community engagement research program, having people with lived experience lead research because they're bringing a different perspective. And I also would go so far as say expertise in their own lived experience that I really believe nobody else has that understanding and knowledge set or expertise unless you've lived it. And I've seen in this type of work where, let's say, when we're doing data analysis and you bring your lived experience, expertise, and understanding to interpreting data, interpretations can look very different from, let's say, somebody who's an academic researcher and wearing that lens and maybe not having the same nuanced understanding as someone with lived experience of fill in the blank, where people can really bring like almost a more robust interpretation of data and understanding maybe some of the underlying nuance elements of that that may get missed otherwise. And so we all bring ourselves to research, especially when we get into qualitative research. And that is a part of the teachings in qualitative research. The researchers do bring themselves into the research process. But if you're able to kind of reflect, okay, what have I learned? What do I know about this topic? And what do I understand based on what's coming from this data and my knowledge set? And then having the group discussions to understand as a group and unpack it together. And maybe you bring in a clinic like or a academic researcher and they can learn like we learn from each other where someone with lived experience might explain why they see or interpret the data in a certain way, and the academic researcher might be able to explain why they interpret the data another way. And now you can have that discussion and come to a decision around, oh, yeah, that actually makes more sense than, say, how I was looking at it, for example, right? I've seen some really amazing things come from involving people with lived experiences in the research where the research is more relevant and meaningful in the end to the people that it matters to most.
I'd like to jump off that idea because there is a book, I just looked it up, called Indigenous Statistics. It's by Chris Anderson and Maggie Walter. One of the ideas they present in that book is about the power of the microscope. And I think that's really what you're talking about. They use the language of a microscope. I'm just, for the sake of argument, going to use the power of holding the telescope because it's a little bit easier. Um, when researchers alone hold the telescope, then they're directing what direction are we looking at? Are we looking up, down, left, right? Who knows what? How far away? How close are we looking? But ultimately, research has to be focused and looked at something. So, regardless of how much we can see in the night sky when we're holding a telescope, whoever holds and points the telescope is the one that sets the parameters for this is what we consider and are focused on. This is what counts, and anything outside of this does not count in a grossly oversimplified analogy. When you have patient partners present, they can move the microscope in so many different ways, in ways that myself, I will say this as a researcher, I have been at tables where I've said, "Hey, wow, yeah, we've gone down a rabbit hole, and this is very researchy, and I'm so excited and interested, and let's do X, Y, and Z as a result." And then someone will come back and say, "Hey, wait a minute, is that most impactful for the people that we're doing this for? Or have you considered something very different?" And there have been a number of times where I've been a little bit humbled, a little bit flabbergasted, usually done with kindness, but sometimes not, saying, "You know what? I got so excited about what I'm interested in that the power and holding the telescope for me took it from a direction that was not what the people that we're working for are most interested in, or might even be asking for clarity on a topic or item." So there are power dynamics in even articulating a research example, question, scope, methodologies, etc. And by having patients present, including Indigenous patients, it changes the field of view of our exploration of the universe around us.
I love that metaphor. It's a great way of looking at it. So I think this is a really good segue to talk a little more about some of the Indigenous PACER research teams that you have supported over the years, and maybe share some of the examples of those projects and the teams.
Oh, I'm excited about this. So Relationships are some of the more important things to me. And I think I mentioned at the beginning of this, my first introduction to Pacer with Tracy and everything was through a cancer grant that we got through the government of Alberta. Um, and we were able to focus on individuals impacted through lived experiences or through their family members with experiences of cancer. Through doing so, we opened up a lot of topics. Um, there was a number of traumatic experiences that were able to be shared. There was a lot of stigma in terms of how do we express or articulate what cancer is and the impact on our family. And in some places, it can be seen as a death sentence, which has its own fear and barriers in front of that, but are compounded even worse when there's access barriers to screening, treatment, prevention, etc. So uh, that was a lovely group of people, and I think I was 2 months. I was still in my probation here at Alberta Health Services. I remember that. And on the first day, we had a unique approach where we had a cohort of 60 Indigenous participants in a week-long intensive program doing the first part of the PACER work and saying, hey, let's unpack what PACER is. So I was on probation, and my boss said, "Hey, Keenan, why don't you get up there and lead an energizer or something?" And I recall my one colleague had stepped outside, and when they came back inside, I was standing on top of one of the tables, and I had everyone going around the room doing full body versions of rock, paper, scissors, just hooting and hollering. And I was like, okay, if this is my introduction to Pacer and working with AHS, I think if I can do stuff like this, I'll get along just fine. With that first cohort, I was so close and involved with the personalities, the Pacer and the University of Calgary staff and teams that organizing our Indigenous program staff that was supporting the implementation, and then supporting a bunch of adult learners through a Western trained intensive learning system, which may or may not it was a bit of a new experience for some individuals. Um, but one great example was, and let me give you a practical example of how we adapted the PACER programming in that setting. There was one stage towards the end where we were talking about how do you run a focus group and what roles and people are present. So, pretty straightforward. Facilitator, a note taker, participants, and pretty much it was six people going around in circle. The Pacer staff were basically saying, anyone who has anything to talk, just talk. Like you're in a focus group, it's going to be hopping back and forth around people and so on and so forth. There was a friction point there. Not that people could had trouble speaking in this practice environment that we're doing. And actually, we're using real live examples. And so the participants and the PACER students were learning and growing closer in their own relationships amongst themselves. But then we said, you know what? We actually don't want this to be an unstructured circle facilitated process. What we're missing here is an elder seated at our table and going away or around in the circle. It just feels off for all of us. And we sat and we said, okay, well, when we raised this, the Pacer team was like, oh, okay. I mean, there's nothing that's not a barrier to implementation. So if you want to use that as an example, please do. And there was a palpable tension in the room that you could almost cut with a knife when people were starting to practice and couldn't really say why it felt so weird, myself included, even though I was just observing and sort of giving advice as we went around the room. But the moment we said, you know what, where are we right now? Oh, we're in Edmonton. Whose territory are we on? Oh, this is what territory we're on, and based on the land acknowledgement that we did. Well, how do they do things in this territory? Oh, it's this way around the circle. So we had, as in that room, it was heavily First Nation and Métis individuals present. We unfortunately had a smaller group of Inuit individuals, and that's okay, but always present. And we were able to say, you know what? Now that we know there's an order to the circle, everything goes smoother, everyone has a chance to speak. We've now adjusted power dynamics because you the value of everyone has a chance or opportunity or choice to speak, even if they say pass, means there's equity even among the research team and the participants. And secondly, even though that we did not have an elder at each of the tables, because there's 10 different tables as we're doing these practice sessions, everyone acknowledged that there is a safety of the participants requirement that would need to be addressed. And our approach is to have an elder with the appropriate experience and rights and sometimes even just personality to be able to say, hi, my name is, I am doing a PACER work. We want to do a focus group on the topic of cancer innovations, approaches, and whatever the scope of the program was, recognizing the participants that we're recruiting might need additional support or might be reassured by having that support present, may we offer tobacco to the elder or knowledge keeper to support the safety of our individuals during a facilitated qualitative process? And by having that individual present, it, from my perspective, you have a mechanism for conflict resolution if anything occurs during the implementation of the research with the participants. You have a safety mechanism to be able to pause and say, you know what, here's an individual here who, hey, let's just pause all of the research. I'm Keenan and you're Sandra, and it's been a heavy day so far. Before we go any further, how are you feeling? And are you supported and feeling safe enough in this environment to share your voice, to share your thoughts for the purpose that we have come today, which ultimately is knowledge generation? So, that's one in my first cohort mechanism where we did some adaptations and started to have. And then in later years, I was able to support different PACER cohorts, mostly funded through Honoring Life, which is a strength-based approach to supporting life promotion. But again, when promoting life, those are very heavy conversations loaded with triggers and stigma and possibilities of intergenerational trauma. So, in a later cohort, as an example, we said in the Research Ethics Board governing documents that is part of the PACER program and submitting, um, they said, we are going to be recruiting Indigenous patients. Check that box, yes. When that happens, the REB process provides additional follow-up questions. Again, in my formal role as program lead of innovation and research within a health institution, I support the additional considerations and impacts of when working with Indigenous people, there are additional checks and balances. I support that. In this particular case, part of the REB feedback was asking it was a younger group of a smaller cohort of 6 Indigenous PACER students doing some honoring life focused work. And they said, our elder will be present as part of the facilitation step. We will be paying the honorarium, and that is the financial contribution for their time, space, and energy. We will be offering them protocol, and in this case, on that territory with that elder, protocol was offering tobacco as, for lack of a better word, contractual obligation of the utmost spiritual intent and importance. And they articulated this in the REB to say, this is what we'll do. And the REB feedback came in and said, well, if the elder is a member of the research team, then they're going to need to complete the TCPS2 online modules to ensure they know how to work with Indigenous people. And we need them to provide that training certification to us before we can approve your thing. And my role in that case, because my role had transitioned to not supporting in so much a mentorship role with the patients as it was a higher level project sponsor and really along the lines of problem identification, and was able to support and say, the role of the elder is from a two-eyed seeing perspective to ensure in this particular case, the spiritual and emotional safety of the Indigenous participants in that setting, using our protocols and approaches that are appropriate in parallel to the requirements of PACER. So it is insulting to um, ask our elders to complete training because our elders have gone through a PhD equivalent of knowledge, comfort, and I struggle to say expertise because that almost sounds braggartly, but a higher level of standard through Indigenous knowledge systems. And we've gone through our vetting process to make sure it is an elder we want to stand by with teachings and knowledge based on the community being served in that area. So no, we will reject this request, but because we want to do research in a good way. And unfortunately, in that case, the REB approval was delayed a number of months, which had an impact on those Indigenous patients to be able to say, man, or so those PACER students to say, we're behind only because we're Indigenous, not even because we're doing anything wrong. We're doing extra work, but understanding and justifying that by a group that's not us is posing barriers. That means our Indigenous PACER cohort is now staggered, delayed behind compared to the non-Indigenous PACER student cohorts, simply because there's additional steps and considerations when doing Indigenous research. So again, if we have relationships and vulnerability and make space for multiple perspectives or two-eyed seeing, that's my proposed solution.
I have a question about, and I haven't taken this training. It's something I would like to take at some point, but is some of what you've just described, about potentially involving an elder outlined in the OCAP principles?
OCAP speaks to ownership, control, access, and possession. This is not a pan-Indigenous idea, but it is something to consider. It was really developed by First Nation peoples first. So that's why I've had some Métis groups or some Inuit groups saying, and even some First Nation groups saying, we don't want OCAP because we have our own thing. And like, great. But this is ultimately Indigenous governance in research, of which OCAP is one example. Just like the United Nations has the fair and care concepts that are pretty much in parallel and supportive. The ultimate idea that I would say behind all of these concepts, loose, broadly grouped under the umbrella of Indigenous governance, is having our voices in a governance structure. So, don't just say, hey, I talked to Keenan once and never talked to him again, and that was Indigenous engagement or governance, but having us a seat at the table with authority, power, and influence and decision making, but also having the appropriate number of seats at the table for the scope of the problem that you're working on and the groups that you're trying to influence. Does OCAP say you should, make sure to pay your elders and to have elders present? No, because it's OCAP is really focused on who owns the data, who controls the data, who can access the data, and who possesses the data. Many of those ideas, when it first came in, I want to say in the 90s or so, but that's what my experiences are. And there was definitely earlier stages, but there was a number of terrible and unethical experiences in research that came out. So, to reduce the distrust and maladaptive research that occurs as a result, things like OCAP were developed to say, okay, we are, in this case, First Nation people. We stand by these principles. If we aren't working with these principles or an equivalency of some type, then that asks earlier or more stronger questions about, is this appropriate in the first place? Are we doing things in a good way, or ultimately are we at risk of causing more harm than we anticipated by not having additional protections and requirements in place?
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. So just maybe as we start to wrap up, we plan on speaking to and would like to speak to the Honoring Life PACER team so that we can get into a little more details to talk about an Indigenous-led PACER research study and learn about the study and the work that they did. And so I'm wondering if you can maybe set the stage in today's episode and share a little bit more background information about how the Honoring Life program came to be, and maybe even why Alberta Health Services decided to sponsor Indigenous-led research.
Whew, again, exciting, and I love your questions. Um, Alberta Health Services has had a long-standing relationship and program supporting, um, I'll say broadly, the mental health of Indigenous people and youth in particular living in in this province. Before my time, I've heard different acronyms and different names for it, so I don't claim to be an expert there, but there were different iterations of this program. And then during my time being employed by Alberta Health Services, the program transitioned into what's now called Honoring Life. Um, what I like about that language is that the community came forward and articulating, this is what we want the program to be. One of the key points that were addressed was, we're sick and tired of being called from a deficit perspective all the time. Can we do something that's the exact opposite of that? Which is the importance of using strength-based language like life promotion, even when it's very difficult topics that, in this particular case, can and has resulted in mortality and people dying and things like that. So the Honoring Life program supports Indigenous communities and organizations across Alberta with preventative, proactive approaches, programming, as well as response and training to things like mental health first aid, coordinating responses when there's a period of stress or even emergency in communities and things like that. So the program has been evolving over time, and especially during the pandemic, and adapting its methods and how do we do things in this world pre and post. Um, and most of the work supports frontline communities doing what makes most sense for their community based on their experiences. It could be anything from uh, culture camps to training of staff to sometimes bringing in other staff or having some types of crisis responses at a relatively smaller amount, which is something the program team has fought hard for to make sure that we have some surge capacity wherever possible to say, hey, your community is going through a crisis right now, however that looks, and here's a resource available or supports. Embedded as a component of honoring life, has been some funding set aside to supporting a PACER cohort. And I believe I've supported three different iterations of Indigenous patient cohorts sponsored and led by Honoring Life. My role right now is mostly through the evaluation support and any higher level problem identification. So I fully support let the program team and let some of the Pacer graduates speak their truth and experiences and lessons. Um, I'm sure they'd have a lot to say in this environment. Um, and I would want to acknowledge that our Pacer students have had a number of outputs, everything from being able to go to conferences that they otherwise would not have been to speak about their experiences and opening their eyes to a different world environment, professional development opportunities that, they were these individuals I'm thinking of were knew that they existed, just never thought that they themselves would be able to go and speak in those venues and how well received they were and approached as equals and followed up when, there's some bravery to enter into that space as well. We've got a number of PACER graduates who are even working on the Honoring Life team now, just because part of the skills that they experienced resulted in a passion and opportunity and skill development that was great for the job and role. Um, as well, our most recent PACER cohort has a publication out in a peer-reviewed journal, and they're just moving forward with their work. And I love how diverse and different each cohort is. And I think that really just speaks to the benefit and diversity of Indigenous voices and peoples present at a table, even the same funding and the same approach, and how vastly different it can be when you consider the relationships present among the students, the relationships they have with the idea of life promotion and the scope of the research that they're going to explore, the relationships they have with the geography and the scope of their research question. Is it provincial or regional? With all Indigenous people or only a certain distinct set for whatever reason or rationale. And also, honestly, how to find closure that I've gone through this 12-month experience and I've learned some more skills through the PACER program and language that I did not have previously. But what do we transition into next? And um, how have I grown as individuals and move forward? So that's my favorite part of the work, seeing the graduates look back over their shoulder at how far they've come before they turn their head back and realize their steps forward on their journey is brighter than they anticipated before. And the word I would say there is empowerment and strength.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing some of the impact from your perspective that you've seen come from the PACER, Indigenous patient-led PACER studies and these teams, these individuals working together through research. So maybe that just leads me to our last question around what's next for you, and maybe a little bit about your own growth that you've experienced through all of this.
What's next for me? I'm continuing on in Alberta Health Services evolution of innovation and research, building off the strategic clinical networks and the vast infrastructure and amazing people and colleagues working in that realm to the new learn and prove together structure that is the current state of innovation in this province. So what I feel uniquely and strongly in support of is looking at some of the power dynamics in institutions and how can how can we support our Indigenous communities and health leaders in this province to have the power to sit at the tables that we work with that impact change related to health service planning, program implementation, and evaluation of outcomes that are meaningful to Indigenous people and not just the health system or a different group that's not ours. So increased voice representation, and it's the darndest thing. I'm a small cog in a big system. Lots of people love sharing power until they realize, wait, I have to give up a little bit of power for someone else to have something that they didn't have before, which leads to a different feeling of vulnerability, especially during a time of change. But isn't time of change the most ideal time to do something significant, such as embedding Indigenous governance within a provincial health system without negatively impacting a nation-to-nation relationship between First Nations in this case, or Indigenous peoples collectively? But I'll use the language of First Nations and the federal government and the rules like that. So I'm going to keep causing trouble with the little corner that I get to work in and hoping that I'll define my success in my career as being there were more doors open behind me than they were ahead of me. And if I can support more Indigenous people and youth and early career professionals and adult learners and to be able to have the skills to enter into two-eyed seeing, enter into ethical space in areas that have impact, and support the existing and future relationality between Indigenous patients and the health research and engagement requirements to improve health services and health outcomes of people in the future.
Well, Keenan, it has been an absolute honor and pleasure to share in this conversation with you today. I am grateful and appreciative of your time, and I want to thank you for being here on today's episode of Pep Talks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Pep Talks, the Patient Engagement Podcast, brought to you by the Alberta Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research Patient Engagement team. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you found it, and we hope you'll join us again for more interesting discussions about patient engagement in health research and healthcare.